And I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you so much for being here and joining me to paint one of my absolute favorite things, which is watercolor flowers. I paint them a lot in a bunch of different settings, and the flowers we will paint today are especially meaningful. Our scene will be inspired by this page that I painted on day 2 of a really wonderful 9-day backpacking trip in the Olympic Mountains. And these are some of the flowers that were found around our camp. We were both had access to some more woodland wildflowers like these two, and then some from a beautiful alpine meadow. And it was just so much fun. So I'm so excited. But I think it's time to get started. So I don't want to take too long on the prep for the flowers. I just want to give us plenty of time to play with them and paint them. But before we do, I wanted to talk briefly about some of the ways of thinking about flowers. And I think one of the hardest things about sketching and painting them is taking this beautifully complex thing that we might see in front of us, right? It's this incredible shape that just has all this complexity, and then deciding how to simplify it down. So I wanted to just share some of the shapes that we'll be working with in this scene, because for me, the easiest way to think about flowers and how to simplify them is to look for the shapes inside of them. So for these lovely paintbrush flowers up here, the shapes that make up the little petals that combine together to make the flower shapes are basically kind of like little flames. So they look about like this. So you can imagine having a bunch of these shapes overlapping each other, and then how those might combine together to make a beautiful flower. And you can add however many few or more layers that you would like, depending on what level of complexity and detail you want inside of your flower. So I'm looking at both the shape of the individual petals, and also I'm keeping my eye on what's the overall shape of this, like the flower, the whole flower bunch. So it might be something like this, some of them, and then some of them might have a shape that's maybe more ovalish like that. And then some will be very, very uneven, and they'll have a bunch of petals off to one side. So for bigger flowers like this, I'm trying to think about, okay, what's the overall shape? And then what are the little flame-shaped pieces, little puzzle pieces that we use to make up those flowers there. And if you're on your page, you can be sketching along with me, whatever feels good to you. Take notes if you want, whatever will make this the most useful and fun time for you. So that's for our paintbrush flowers. For our lupin flowers, honestly, they were one of the more intimidating flowers for me until I started to just figure out a good and easy way to break down the shapes. So my favorite way to think about lupin is that we have usually a little stem that comes off of a main stem. And these shapes are going to be a combination. You can think of them as like butterfly wings or kidney beans, or so I think of like little beans. So we usually have the bottom bean right here. Then we have the upper bean right there. And sometimes there's more or less overlap depending on how much we want them. And one side is more rounded, one side is usually, but not always, more pointy. So sometimes we see a whole bunch of that second little bean. So I break my lupin flowers down into beans. And then the top portion of the flower is very often just beautiful little overlapping ovals that will stick out from the stem. So, and again, these might be funny terms to be describing petals, right? Beans and flame shapes. But whenever I'm working on thinking about really sketching anything, I find that the more that I can get myself using language that, especially in my head when I'm thinking about a scene, that focuses on shape and less on I'm painting a lupin flower, then it gets less intimidating because I'm training my brain to not get too overwhelmed with the whole total complexity and just see shapes. Sometimes flowers are lovely and simple, like our little twin flowers. They are basically a triangle. And then on the bottom of that triangle, we have some smaller little triangles. So when we combine those shapes with a little bit more finesse, it'll come out and it'll have our little petal shapes along the bottom. So twin flower are gloriously somewhat easier to sketch, thankfully. So I love finding those in scenes, and they're always beautiful and symmetrical and really fun to sketch. Possibly the most complex flower that we will play with today, and we may or may not put both of the blooms here, we'll see, is this flower here. And I think it's a queen's cup. If someone knows for sure that it's different than that, please correct me in chat. I can't remember 100%. But this one is interesting because when we look at these flower shapes, you can see that some of the petals are in the back part of these flowers. See how those petals are wrapping away from us? But we can see a pretty traditional petal shape. It looks like this. which is a lot of what our brains know petals will look like. This kind of flower gets harder when we start to have the petals in the front of the flower that actually start to wrap back toward us. So we have an effect called foreshortening. And these whole flowers overall are interesting because we're not looking at them from the top down. If you were to look at a queen's cup from the top down, it might look something more like this. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, there's 6 petals in there. There we go. So if you look at it from a top-down view, the flower might be something like this. But when we turn it to the side, and I have this beautiful pine cone over here, it's not from a pine tree. I don't recall what tree it's from. I found it in my neighborhood many years ago. So this is we can imagine this as our queen's cup from the top. The hard thing here is that we are actually seeing these flowers a little bit from the side. So that means that not only are we now seeing the petals, they're starting to wrap toward us and foreshortening, but we're also starting to see a little bit of the bottom or the base of those petals as they come toward the stem. So if it's helpful, one of the ways that I try to think about flowers sometimes is that the top-down view is like looking at it a big circle. As we lower our point of view in relation to that flower, so you can imagine going from standing looking down at it to then sitting on the ground, possibly beside it, or even lying on the ground looking at the flower, we will start to, as we go lower in relation to the flower, it starts to tilt, and our flower will go from an overall more circular shape to it slowly will go into a more ovally shape. And our petals inside of that space will have to change their perspective. They might get flatter, or they might get a little bit taller in the back, depending on which way they're reaching. But overall, instead of looking top down, we then have this more ovally effect. So then the petals will get foreshortened, both leaning away and then reaching toward us. And like I mentioned, some of them then also come toward us. And honestly, the easiest way that I think about it is that I'm just looking for petals that do that. I just look for what's the shape of the portion that folds over. It'll often be some variation of a triangular-ish shape just because of how these petals often work. So I think I look for, first of all, what's my triangle thingy? And then I look for, okay, how does the rest of the petal connect to that? So I have a triangle thingy, and then over here I might have a triangle-ish thingy, and then the bottom part of the petal wraps down. And it really won't look like much, right, until we start to get the context of the other petals inside and around that flower to help our brains understand the shape that we're looking at. But to me, that's one of the hopefully big takeaways of our time today is that when we're thinking about sketching flowers, and especially really anything that's smaller, I really want to be looking for the shapes of those flowers on my page and just in the scene. That will be hopefully very helpful. I'm checking my number here. Oh, good. We still haven't maxed out my Zoom. That makes me happy. We had a just small enough group today that there's still a few spots available. So there's our little overview of shapes, the colors and how to handle them. I'll go into all of that as we're working across our page. So I won't spend time breaking that down, especially for a shorter lesson like this. So I'm going to go ahead and turn over this piece of paper. And I'm not going to sketch at the full size that I did over here. It won't be quite that big, but we won't be too far off. And I'll just begin with my pencil. And you have the option on your page to make an arrangement of flowers if you would like, or if you feel more comfortable or it feels less intimidating or whatever it is. You could also just put your flowers across the page like this. That would be a totally wonderful and easier option for some, possibly, to have them sequentially across your page and have those shapes separate. So it's really up to you and whatever will be the most helpful and fun for you during our painting time together. So please don't stress about, sticking exactly with my arrangement and that kind of thing. And also, since we do have a pretty big group today, and because I can't see, all of your pages and whatnot in terms of how fast we're going, I will obviously sketch slower than I would if I were out in the field, so I'll be explaining things. But if I get ahead of you at any point, I just encourage you, please try not to stress about it, and just know that that recording will be sent out to you tomorrow sometime. I shoot for midday sometime. And that way you can always tune back into that recording and have the opportunity to watch along with me and catch up later. So again, if you get behind, please don't stress. And I have a favorite phrase I like to mention during my classes. And the first of them is that we're not always going to prove out a masterpiece. I certainly don't with flowers. Sometimes I make a beautiful arrangement and sometimes I make a beautiful mess. So I just encourage you to, as you're thinking about that and as we paint together, just to try to, approach our page and our sketch with a spirit of exploration instead of expectation. So try not to stress too much about any of that. And sorry, that's the garage door. I'll pause for just a second so I can cut that out of the, of the recording. My studio space is above a garage door space, and hopefully they will leave that open. So when I'm thinking about how to even approach and start sketching a scene, very often, and I can slide myself over a tiny bit, what I will do is I'll start with, okay, what's my anchor visual inside of a scene? Sometimes that's going to be a flower. Sometimes that anchor visual might be this shape in the middle of this tree canopy. If I was working on a painting like this one over here, which is actually a piece from, this is an Adventure Art Academy lesson I filmed on an ice field in the Yukon. My anchor and focal point was this big mountain in the middle. So I will try to get some of those lines down, or I'll start with whatever the biggest line in that scene is. So here, that was this bottom snowfield zone, this border of the ice field. And for our scene today, this big flower is feeling big and intimidating. So I want to get that one done early and first. And I'm going to make it, about this big right here. So that way I have space on either side. So I don't have to be so terribly perfect with my arrangement. With a flower like this, I'll often begin with just putting maybe some of the little stameny thingies inside of that middle of the flower. Those little yellow bits in the middle. I can see most of the stamens on this flower here. I'll put those in. So I have, okay, there's the center of my flower. And then I start looking for what's the easiest petal to sketch first. And I think that's going to be this beautiful one that arcs across the bottom right below the stamens, arcs across and then down. And this one makes that funny little foreshortened tip over. So it has the part that folds over, and that will just roll right over there. It's a rounded triangle. And along the left side now, we have the bottom part of that petal connects down to the bottom. So there's our first petal on our flower. There we go. So once I have one, and at this stage, I will also look at it and say, okay, is that big enough? Like that kind of thing. And it's looking roughly the right size. I could make it a little bit bigger if I wanted to, but that's fine. We'll roll with it. Up next to that one is a beautiful petal that starts right near the angle of where that petal rolls over. And this one's fun because it goes up, and then it has this little flat top dip. And then from that dip is where our little folded over piece comes over. So there's a little flat dippy bit. It's like an oval cut off in the middle. And then right down below that is going to be our bottom portion that will wrap around toward the bottom of that flower. And you might notice as I'm going along, I'm refining my lines. Like I needed that to be a little bit more rounded. This one's looking pretty good. That one can be a little bit longer. So I'm not afraid to adjust my lines as I go along inside of my flower. And for one like this, I'm just going to keep rolling right around the shape. So now we have our beautiful little left-hand side petal. That one will go somewhere in there. Is that too big? Very possibly. We have to fit 6 petals in here somewhere. So I might take off a little bit of that petal there. And then we have an oval one that reaches back behind. And then on this right-hand side, we have this beautiful, it's more of an oval on the left-hand side, and it's kind of like a kidney bean with a little bit of a rounded edge over there. So we can also think of a beanie shape over there. I have 5 petals so far, so the 6th is this little bit smaller one that was a little bit diminutive on this flower. So that 6th petal will stretch out from that right-hand side. And there we go. We have our first Queen's Cup flower on our page. And at this stage, I'm not going to worry about, if I want to, I could come in here and erase some of my overlapping lines if they don't work exactly right, but I'm not going to stress about it too much. Oh yeah, and someone noticed the kneaded eraser. So my little mechanical pencil has the most wimpy, tiny, useless eraser of all time on the end of it. So I took a kneaded eraser, which comes in a big chunk like this, and you can just pull the eraser apart, and then I wrap some around. And if you folks have questions, please don't hesitate to drop them in the chat. I have it open on my computer and I can see it there. So please don't hesitate. If it's a really relevant question to where we are in our time together, I'll hop in there and answer it. So yeah, there's our first flower. And since I know that I'm personally going to come through and add some waterproof ink with a fine tip pen to this, I'm also not stressing about getting everything super well defined with my pencil. So the ink can be a layer that will help us add additional detail there. And then continuing on, let's add our little lovely stem to this flower. It'll just wrap right down through there. And here's where for leaves, they're basically just glorified XL-sized petals. So some of our leaves, like this one right here, is just a oval, it's like a surfboard shape. So there's another instance of trying to find the shapes, right? So here's our surfboard, and this surfboard shape will reach up behind, and then it goes all the way behind that whole beautiful flower. And I just want to, when I'm making a line that goes behind the flower like that, I can draw it all the way through if I want, or I can just go sketch, lift up the pencil, and then finish that line. So that way it does have that nice feeling of continuity, and then it would be a continuous line through it. There's our big surfboard number one. I'm going to jump over here. Now let's put a surfboard number two, but this is a sideways surfboard. So now we have this one that will reach across. And this one will come to a cute little tip over here. So it is like a little wave now. So there's that edge, and it will wrap aside like this. And then I think I'm going to keep this one simple. And my original scene has this little fold over, which you can add if you want. I'm just going to bring that leaf right into the bottom and keep it easier for myself, so I don't have as much to sketch and paint for that little buddy. This one over here is, so where these leaves right here, we were looking at them like this, and leaves often have a line down the middle. That's where the main vein of the leaf is. This leaf over here, we are looking at, if we, instead of flat down, we're now looking at this leaf is a little bit folded like this. So we're looking at just one half of that leaf. And when we have something like that, that will give us that characteristic very straight back to that leaf. So to make sure I put it in the right place, I am going to start with the initial upper edge, a little bit more ruffled edge. So I'll put that part in, and then I can roll over and have that arc all the way back down toward the bottom. So there's roughly my leaf shape. And again, I'm not being shy about going back through and re-chiseling out these shapes if I need to. I'm also sketching a fair bit darker than I would if I wasn't on camera, because I want you guys to be able to see what's happening with my page. So I make things a little extra dark. And if this line is feeling really extra straight and just paste it on, then you can always redraw it with just a little bit more of an angle back toward the edge of that leaf. And then there's a whole lot of leafy fun things happening over here, which we'll just simplify into there's a leaf right there. And then, so I'm like a kidney bean with a little bump. This one will be a surfboard with some challenges. So there's our surfboard-ish shape. And then we have one big, beautiful, super fun leaf that goes behind this flower. And it's like an extra wide surfboard shape. And the reason that I put all of these leaves around this flower was that I realized that in order to have this white flower really stand out on my page, I wanted to have it surrounded by green. So that was the easiest way to achieve that, was just to put my beautiful leaves all around it and make my life easier for myself. Flower number one done, and the biggest and most challenging one, honestly. The rest of the flowers will not be anywhere near as complicated as that one. I think we're going to skip the second white Queen's Cup flower as well, just for ease of sketching. Up here, up above this one, we'll put in both of our beautiful little paintbrush flowers. So let's start with a stem, and that will go up part way, and then we'll have a second stem that maybe will come out right about here. So we'll have our two flowers up in this zone. I want this one to be a little bit higher than the left one. And when I'm thinking about how to approach these shapes, don't forget, again, I'm thinking about that overall wrap around shape there. Oh, somebody asked if I could put the finished painting on the screen. I sure can. There we go. There you go. Is that better for folks? You can see both of them side by side. I can actually, since I don't have the paints out yet, I can come over even further. Thanks for, perfect. There we go. Now you can see that little one there. All right. So both of our beautiful, switching gears to our paintbrush flowers. And for this one, if I wanted to, I could sketch in, right, with little tiny dots or dashes. I could put in the overall outline of the flower, meaning the exterior simplified shape of it. But sometimes I don't want to bother with that. So especially if I'm in the field and I'm cold and hungry and there's mosquitoes, I will just dive right in and just start putting in my fiery shapes here. So just making, and these might look like I'm just going a little bit higgledy-piggledy, but when I was down there actually looking at the flower, my goal for flowers is I want to be sketching as little as possible of the actual details. I want to have just enough detail that it looks correct, but not so much that I'm here all day or wherever I'm hanging out, miles from camp or whatever it is. So I want to have just enough detail that it reads correctly as a flower, but not so much that I'm here for a while. And one of my most favorite things about paintbrush flowers are these little, sometimes you see them, there's a little extra colorful, bright yellow petals that will occasionally just stick out of the flower. And I find them so charming and happy. And that got a bit bigger than my other one. Does it matter? No. Now I want to put in another one right next to it. So instead of starting at the bottom, I might start with the upper petal right here, just so I can get the proximity correct for these two. And there's that. And I will also be, because I'm putting an ink layer, if you fall behind, that ink layer will be a good chance where you can catch up with your sketch. This one is looking a little bit more squat. So that one's taller and narrower. This one's a little bit squatter, which is nice because that more closely mimics the natural variety we have in our flowers. I often work really hard to make sure that or try not to duplicate the same shapes over and over again. It's really easy when we're sketching just to go a little bit on autopilot and forget to make sure our shapes have enough deviation like the actual thing we're observing. Okay, over next to these friends is going to be our lupin, which again used to be one that very much intimidated me. So there's the bottom part of the stem. The flowers will terminate somewhere down here. And then the whole sprig will reach up about that far. So I know that I'll finish my little sprig up there. And for this one, like I mentioned, at the top, I just have my little rounded oval shapes. And these will be for the flower petals that have not yet opened and haven't started to open. As I go down this shape, I will start getting to some spots where, okay, we have a slightly kidney bean shape there, but oh, that's overlapped by this flower petal here that hasn't opened. So I'm looking for spots like that where I can have this unopened flower right here that links down to my main stem. So I'm just trying to give myself space to be able to build in areas of overlap. And I also want to make sure I'll have at least a couple flowers down here like this one that completely overlap that whole stem. So that way we don't end up with just flowers on either side of that main central area. But again, I'm a big fan of keeping things as simple as possible. So whenever I can, I'll just put a little shape off to the side because the less foreshortening and overlapping that I have to do, the easier it is to sketch. We'll jump down a little bit farther, put a tiny stem base for this shape here. This one looks almost like a little boat. So it has a little sprig that sticks up, and then it has this bottom part that wraps up almost straight and then comes down like that. So butterfly wings, whatever shapes work for you. I encourage you to find whatever shapes and shape language will help you feel comfortable and having fun along the way here. So this one over here is just right next to the stem. This one on the right side sticks up a bit more. So it has this, and usually with lupin, the bottom kidney bean is bigger than the upper kidney bean. Just the way they usually work. And the one I found in this meadow was actually a little bit simpler as well than some of the ones I found where they have a whole bunch of flowers really tightly clumped together. So I was happy about that when I was at this location. Next up is one that this was kind of a complicated flower right here. So I decided to simplify it into roughly 3 little components just because that seemed like the easiest way to handle it. So it has the upper part and then these 2 parts up top. And is that exactly how that flower looked in person? Probably not, right? But does it have to be? Absolutely not. Over here, again, I wanted to make an extra fun shaped little flower there. And as we go down, these are all looking pretty similarly spaced. So I knew that I wanted to throw in some flowers, like right here, there's a very simplified one that would overlap a little bit. I wanted to have another one right here that would also overlap my little friends next to it and have a nice long stem. And then just to make sure, again, I was breaking up that monotony of the stem going all the way across, I want one flower, big one right here, to overlap. That's a little bit too big, a little overzealous there, to overlap the whole stem. And maybe I want that actually a little bit higher as well. So that way it actually contacts and bunches all these together. So maybe this little friend will contact that one and then the stem comes down below. And then maybe we'll have one more big one. And this one I was like, I don't know what's happening with this flower. So we're just gonna do our best. We'll put like 4 little parts and then a big poofy part on the bottom and maybe put a petal that goes like that just for fun. And maybe I could put even an extra petal right there, right? Like things don't have to be perfect to to still read as a flower. There might even, oh, I think what actually I see it now. There were two flowers there. So there's two flowers overlapping each other. So that makes a little more sense when I see it that way. Should matter of reminding my brain what I was actually looking at. So there's our lupin. Yay. Hopefully that was not too terribly scary to put that in. Lupin leaves are very funny. They look vaguely adjacent to marijuana leaves. So I try to make sure they don't have the characteristic tapery tips of those leaves. Otherwise, folks get confused. So for these, we're not going to paint too many of these leaves in. I'll just put a few of them. I literally will just start with the stem that supports the big leaf. And then from there, you can just radiate out these beautiful, there's one, two, I don't even bother counting as much anymore. I just radiate out the little petals, not the petals. It's kind of like painting a flower. Radiate out the leaves from there. And then when they go behind a flower like this, we just have a rough approximation of the radiating shapes like that. Am I stressing about getting them all perfectly exactly where they should be? No. So this flower up here, someone asked how to label them. This is our paintbrush flower. The name used to be Indian paintbrush, and thankfully the Indian portion of that has been dropped. So now it's just the paintbrush flower. It makes it a little bit harder to talk about when we're painting, as you can imagine, because we were saying we'll pick up our paintbrush to paint our paintbrush. This one over here, the purple, is a lupin. And the white one over here is a queen's cup. I believe that's true. Again, if someone else has better knowledge about that, then please don't be afraid to correct me on that one. And are we feeling like that's pretty good? How do we start there? And if we have extra time at the end, we could sketch in our little baby friends over here, the little twin flowers. And this flower over here, I don't know the exact name of this species, but it's of the family of epiphytes, which are it's actually probably not, I don't know if flower is even the right term. They're a plant that doesn't have their own chlorophyll. So they basically attach their roots to the root system of a Douglas fir or a different plant. And then they pull nutrients from that other root system. So really fascinating little buddies there. But I think for time's sake, let's leave those off. If you'd like to add them, this will stay here. Someone said pine drop. Okay, there we go. So now I think we know the name. That sounds actually familiar for that one. So this epiphyte is called a pine drop, which is super fun. And if that's not an epiphyte and I was confusing my names, please, please do correct me. I do my best, but when I'm in the field, I don't have my field guide with me. They're usually too heavy. Okay, I want to give folks a chance to get caught up if you did fall a wee bit behind. So I'm going to just briefly add my ink lines to my flowers and petals. Do I stress about getting these ink lines perfect? Clearly not. I just put them in roughly where they go, going right over my pencil lines. I can go over the pencil lines more than once if I feel so inclined. Again, just trying to give a little hint of what's happening if I want that extra definition. You can see it does add quite a bit of extra definition to something. I will also use the ink as a chance to add extra definition to my flowers. And again, if you don't have the ink that's waterproof, then don't put it on if it's not waterproof. And then just don't stress, and you can just have your beautiful pencil lines showing through. I most of the time will let my pencil lines stay inside of a sketch. I know a lot of folks try to get rid of them, but I've really come to appreciate my pencil lines recently as just a fun record of what was interesting to me and what were the initial details I found compelling about a scene. So I've changed my thinking a little bit, and now I leave them in more often than not inside of a scene. Okay, there's our little leaves painted there. Not painted, they're just sketched. If you have any questions so far, please feel free to drop them in that chat. I will circle to the ones that are the most relevant to our point where we are right now. Oh yeah, the bell-shaped ones over here are called twin flower. As you can see that the flowers always, usually, unless something's come and eaten one of them, the vast majority of the time will have two flowers that are very, very close in shape and size atop a single stalk. So they're just super cute little fun little friends over there. And they're tiny, right? These flowers are yay big. So I had to make them a little bit bigger on my page. And obviously not all of this, these are actually not too far off from scale, actually. Only the twin flowers might be a tiny bit bigger than you might sometimes find them in the field. And I don't want to forget about my beautiful yellow stamens inside of this flower. So I have to put those back in. There we go. I'm just contouring around all of these beautiful petals. Sometimes if I have a flower like this one right here, which really is, in some ways, it's one of the focal points of this arrangement. So this arrangement right now has 4 flowers. I sometimes will try to do an arrangement of 5, but I might put a little leaf over here and that would help balance it out as well. But sometimes for the flowers, if I feel so inclined, I can go over some of my pen lines a second time. You can see how that will just give a little bit of extra heft to that shape. I don't have to do that, but for white flowers especially, I often will find that I am inspired to want to go back and add a little bit of stuff there. So just adding in my beautiful, my nice little ink lines here. Am I stressing about being perfect? Definitely not. Especially for these lupin petals, they're going to be painted, and as you can see here, they're being put in very, very loosely. So I want them to feel a little bit farther behind than everything else. So one of the ways to do that is to have them have less detail, because when we're looking at a scene and a painting, in general, and obviously generalizations always have instances where they don't apply, but in general, the area of the painting that has the most detail will usually feel the closest to us, especially if we bias it toward the lower part of our page. There's other ways that we can increase or decrease the depth of a painting, but level of detail is a very easy one to play with, especially for closer in scenes like this. So put in my lupin with my pen, and the paint will be fun because we have enough flowers happening here that we will get to dance around the page a little bit and work on this in a way that will mimic very closely how I approach working on this in the field. As you can see, I'm just not stressing about being perfect here, right? Like if I had the actual photos of these flowers, they wouldn't be these exact same perfect little shapes. And that's intentional. I want to make this attainable to sketch in a short amount of time, usually in the field. So I'm facilitating that by simplifying and distilling these down into the most basic shapes that I can. And then I can even push that further as I'm sketching in the ink layers here, continuing that distillation process. And also, I have been sketching flowers quite a bit this year, so I'm feeling more comfortable and confident with them than I definitely was even like 6 months ago. So in the summer, I made a concerted effort to try to sketch them with some frequency in the field. And I also, right now, you might have noticed, just added in the leaves for my paintbrush flowers. So these are just little arcing shapes. They're like elongated raindrops. So they have a little bit of taper at the bulbous base of the raindrop, and the tip of that leaf then comes to a fine point. So there's our leaves there. And then here's can't forget about this beautiful lupin leaf over here. Put that frill friend in. Again, I want to sketch that pretty loosely. And I think I also want to put in a lupin leaf down here just to help put something else on that bottom corner of our arrangement. And now we're ready to start painting. Yay! Again, if you've fallen behind, oftentimes folks do just keep playing with whatever you have on your page. Don't stress about it. There will be plenty of time later to explore the recording. And where did I lose my paper towel? There we go. My palette is a right mess right now. I was working on a different painting with it. So just take a moment here to quickly clean off a portion of the mixing space. I was actually doing a 16 by 20 inch painting with this little palette. So I was trying to mimic the effects I got when I was painting in the field in Arizona. And sometimes I find it easier to replicate effects if I just use the same exact tools. So even though I have a bigger palette at home, using the small palette helps me remember and think back to that space. And also, I know exactly where all the colors are in this one, where my big one I'm still not quite used to. As far as a paintbrush, I'm going to do the entire painting in this single number 10 round paintbrush. This is one of my favorite brushes. It has a nice fine tip. If you find that your paintbrush is not going to a fine enough tip for you, please don't stress about it. Just go ahead and if you have a smaller paintbrush, you can switch to that. So when I'm looking at a scene like this, and whether it's this or a big landscape, there's some strategy involved if I want to be able to paint this basically as fast as possible. If you've painted with me before, then you know that I am a very big fan of shortcuts and speed. So one of the ways that I can facilitate being able to paint more quickly is if I can be painting in different parts of the painting while one area dries, I'm working somewhere else. So when I'm looking at this scene, I can immediately tell that one of the biggest areas is that leaf zone. So I think I'm going to put my first layer of color down in that whole zone. And then I'll jump up to these flowers over here, because we can work in as many different areas as we want, as long as they're separated by some clean, dry white paper. And my paper is not tilted. It's just flat on my page. I don't think it looks tilted. Sometimes my camera gets a little bit wonky, but I prefer like the vast majority of the time when I'm painting for myself, I have the page flat. The reason for that is I really love these blooming patterns, these like fractalized soft edges, and just letting the pigment do some of the hard work for me. And that's easier when it's flat. In my Adventure Art Academy classes filmed outside, for those, I do have the page tilted up because I want folks to be able to see my page and the view and the scene. So in those situations, there are times where I'll have to just like hand hold the camera so I can put the page flat and get the blooming patterns to happen. Always an adventure painting outside. The color that I want for my main leaves, I'm going to use a primary blue, basically. It's cobalt blue. Use whatever you have that's as close to this as possible. Or it doesn't have to be close, don't stress about it. And I'll use my lighter yellow called Hansa Yellow Medium. I want to make a nice bright green color here. And I'll just mix that up right there. Don't want it to be too dark, so more yellow than the blue. And then I can put that into this space. In some spots, maybe I want a little bit more yellow, so I can just quickly grab some more yellow on the paintbrush, carefully contouring around the white edge of the petals, and then not so carefully contouring around the edge of the leaf. If I get the edge of the leaf outside of the leaf boundary, that's one of the really forgiving things about painting flowers, is that it really doesn't matter. As long as I don't go totally haywire and just like put the line out in the middle of nowhere, no one's going to care or really even notice that there is a deviation there, which is one of the reasons why flowers are so much fun to paint, because they're just so much more forgiving than other things. Can't be that laissez-faire with painting faces or animals. There's the first layer of paint there, and I'm going to stick with almost the same color throughout a lot of the zone because I'll be dropping in some more blue as I go along. So this whole background one will also be a very similar color. And then, like I said, only really being careful with my brush strokes right up against the white edge of that flower. Otherwise, just putting it down and not stressing about it. So then what I will do is that as this starts to dry, we will drop in some more blue or yellow, depending on where we are inside of the petal. And then we will use that to help give some extra texture and personality to our beautiful leaves. For some of the leaves, like this one over here, I know that I want it to be more yellow on this upper edge. So I just added more of my Hansa Yellow Medium to the mixture. And if I want to get fancy, I could even right now just put some of the more, like a more heavily green cobalt mixture on the bottom. So you can play with either putting a whole base layer and then you like do it, or putting part of the leaf in, then putting a darker mixture next to it. But before this starts to dry out over here, I want to add a little bit of my cobalt blue and my yellow right in here is a little bit darker green that will just reach up across the leaf and add a little bit of nice variation into that shape. So I want to have a little bit of interesting stuff happening there. And I'm also going to take some clean water and drop in some clean water along just a couple of spots to encourage some watercolor blooms to happen. I may have been a little bit premature with that, so it might have been too wet still. This one I think will do it. If I put some water along this edge, it will bloom really prettily there. I want the same effect of that leaf on the one right below it, where I have more yellow right at the top of that leaf, and then we'll have more blue along the bottom. And you might notice that right there, I left a couple little very small white gaps. That was intentional because anywhere I leave a little tiny minuscule white line there, that will act like a traffic cop and will keep these two areas from mixing too much. I had one little spot that touched, so I will get some mixing, but I don't mind. I just wanted to show that in case it was interesting. You can also leave little areas of white like that right there that can act as a highlight on a leaf if you want. I often forget to do that, but it can be a really fun and beautiful effect to add to a painting. For this leaf over here, same approach, the more yellowy mixture, and I'm going to leave a little white line right up next to, in close proximity to that blue up there, and then I'll just carry it to the edge of the leaf as we go across there. Same thing with this one, the blue, and we'll just go along the bottom edge, and I might get rid of a little bit of that highlight there, so it's not too obvious anymore. There we are. Oh, and this big leaf up here, I almost forgot about this big friend. I definitely want more of my blue mixture, so it's mostly a blue-green, back in this one, because I want it to be darker than the ones next to it. I should have left a little white line there as well, because I might get some bleeding of this color into the other leaf. And if I do, I'll just wipe some of it out. That's totally okay. But I did want to, before I almost forgot, put some more of that darker blue right in that base area to try to make that seem like a nice shadowed zone. And I can lift out a little bit of that color right there as well. We're making progress. This leaf here, I don't want it to totally blend into its neighbors, so I might give it a little bit of time before I come back and paint that one. And hopefully you can see on the screen as well the difference here between the different effects. So this one, I didn't get very much blooming at all. This one, I'm getting a lot of watercolor blooming along this edge, that fractalized pattern. I like that, so I'm going to come over here and drop a bead of clean water right across the middle and then the lower edge of this whole leaf. And I also might put in a little bit along that bottom edge too. And just for fun, so there's some symmetry here, I'll put some water inside of this one just to see what happens. And maybe a little bit inside of this top of this leaf as well. Blooms are beautifully and wonderfully and challengingly unpredictable. They don't always adhere to our visions for their effects, but I still love them. So I still use them with a lot of frequency in my sketches and paintings. Moving right along now into our flowers up here. So I want this to dry a wee bit before I come back to this beautiful petal. I think our flowers up here, we may have to do probably just 2 layers of color. So I'm gonna wipe off a little spot here for myself again. And we'll switch to our paintbrush flowers. My base color, my pink is very, very dirty. So let me clean this little friend off here. I think I'm gonna combine my pinks and my reds together. So there's some of my pinky rose color. And I'll add, my red is also a mess. There we go. Essentially a little bit of red to that. That's still pretty dark. So we have to add a tiny bit of yellow. Let's see, tiny bit of yellow to that mixture as well. There we go. I want just a tiny bit less rose and a little bit more, I don't know what you call that, peachy, I guess. But I don't want it to be too dark, so I'll rinse the paintbrush off, grab a little bit more of my peachy color, and then just start coming in here into my beautiful paintbrush flowers. And my color here is not quite as vibrant as it could be because you can see my palette was quite dirty down here. So I have some blues and stuff in there that really shouldn't be there, but it doesn't matter, no. And when I'm adding this base layer of color in here, just like I did on my leaf for some areas of interesting texture and pattern, I had that beautiful little bit of white highlighting. I'm also going to leave some white highlighting along some of my petal edges, especially where they meet each other. So like right there, this zone right here, I'll leave a little bit of white in there as well. So I can always cover up the white, but I can never get it back. And I just am a huge fan and really, really love the way that basically the effect of having some white intermingled with our darker colors. I find that it just adds a lot of interesting texture and pattern and luminosity to a scene in a way that that's like much harder to achieve actually if I just use purely layers of color. So it's another one of those shortcuts that I talk about with some frequency, that the white lines can stand in for so many different things inside of a painting that I just find them to be a very powerful tool to use. There's a base layer. Let's call that good for those flowers. And our lupin, thankfully, they are much easier to paint than they are to draw. So for my lupin, I want, again, a clean-ish space on my palette. And I'm going to just use the same blue I was using before. So I'll get a spot that doesn't have a ton of green in there. And you can probably tell from my palette that I am not too concerned about keeping all of my colors clean. I've discovered I think it's almost impossible to keep a palette perfectly clean, so I don't even try anymore. It just doesn't happen. So I just don't worry, I don't stress about it. And if I need a little clean spot, I just wipe it off and then I'm good to go. And I don't want my blue to be just a pure blue. I'm going to add just the tiniest little bit of my rose to that. So I have a slight purplish blue. And then I'll also make a puddle of pink right next to it so I can draw from that pink as well. And to that pink then, I'm going to add the tiniest little bit of blue. So I have a slightly purplish pink. So we have our 2 colors. And then as we're going along, I'll start with some purplish pink. And we're going to do similar things in the leaves where we try to get our pigments to work together on the page while they're still wet to create interesting interfaces. So we don't have to paint every little area of detail. Sometimes if I'm skipping over here and this is still wet, I will put my little pinky finger down somewhere dry, and that acts like my little anchor point or a redder. So I have a safe point to hold my hand up above the wet portion. This is dry enough so I can rest my whole hand, but very often you actually can't. So in that case, little pinky finds a safe haven, and then that's how I navigate across a more wet page. I'm also trying to keep my hand out of your view, so I'm sliding my fingers way far away from the tip of the paintbrush, farther than I would normally if I were working on my own painting. And I'm starting out with this purple color just right on the upper edges of some of these flowers. So I'm not doing all of them, but I will definitely put it on some. So on the upper kidney bean shape, gets some of this little purpley pink pretty color, some more than others. And some will carry it all the way into the other little kidney bean shape as well. So there's our initial passive color. Oop, I forgot about these friends down here. Can't forget that. There's our initial passive color. And then rinsing the paintbrush off, wipe it off so I don't have too much paint on there. Pick up the blue now, and if I might want a little bit more of that mixture as well, just a smidge, I can just combine my puddles. There we go. So now I have a nice lavendery purple color, and I'll just come in with that lavendery purple color, also relieving some white areas on my lupin. So I'll just put that lavendery purple color right up to, right next to my other peachy color, and then just let those colors blend together and work together across the page. And I can tell right now on my page that this might be a little bit more purple than I might go for. So if that's the case, I'll just rinse the paintbrush off, and then I can switch to a more vibrantly, much more saturated cobalt blue. And I can use that for some of the edges of my other flowers. So just dropping that in, and hopefully you can see how this can be a little bit faster way to paint these flowers in, because I'm just letting the pigments blend together and really just encouraging the paint to do as much of the hard work for me as it possibly can. Are they perfect? No. And did this get a little bit dark up here? Yes. So if it got a little bit dark, I can take the paper towel and just boop, tap the paper towel into that whole shape, lift off some of the paint that I didn't like because it wasn't quite dry yet. And then I can come back in with my other paintbrush and reapply the paint in a little bit more controlled manner, just to bring some of those shapes back to life a little bit. And we have our lupin. They're a little bit darker. You can see them in my other paintings, so I can always take a semi-damp brush and lift out some of that pigment if I want, but I think it's decently close, so we'll call that good for those little friends. And now this is where things get fun, because while those are drying up there, I don't want to paint my leaves or my stems that would put green where I don't want it. I can just jump right back down here to the color that I was using for my leaves, and I can put in this leaf. So I jump all across a painting. I am definitely not an artist who follows the old adage of working on a scene from background to foreground. I found that to be inefficient and tedious when I'm working in the field. And honestly, like, a lot of how I work is deeply informed by just the amount of time and my love for sketching and painting outside. So I really tried to make it my goal to find techniques that could facilitate that experience as efficiently as possible. You may notice right there that I got a little bit too much blue along that upper edge. So when that happened, I just wiped the paintbrush off and then gently slid that paintbrush into that blue area and just lifted right off some of that color that I didn't want. So, there is ability and flexibility to change and maneuver paint around our page, even if it's already down. I decided I wanted a little bit more blue there. And I actually also want a little bit more blue-green color, mostly the blue right in here in this background zone. I just want an overall darker, so both blue and yellow, to make a bluish, darkish green. And I just want this whole area back here to really feel like it's nestled and a little bit more shadowed. So in order to then have that blend in with the rest of my leaf, I put the paint down, rinse the paintbrush off. Doesn't have to be a perfect rinse, not by any means. Wipe off the extra. And then with this now just barely damp brush, that's a little bit too wet still if it leaves behind a lot of water. So you can see it leaves just a little bit of green on me. It could be perfectly clean, could be slightly damp, whatever you want. Slightly damp brush, and I'll just feather and fade that blue right up into the rest of my leaf. And I don't even have to cover all areas of it. I just had to encourage it to go up, and I can even do that right around my flower again as well if I want. So I start with a little application of paint. It doesn't quite blend in and sit yet. Take that just damp brush and just smear it out and encourage it to blend outward a little bit. I'm getting some bleeding right here because this wet zone touched that one. Doesn't matter. Nobody but me might have noticed that, right? Like, it's not a big deal. But I'm liking that effect so much that I think I also want to come back through here on this other leaf and add just a smidgen of that same effect right in through here, just to also send this leaf a little bit farther back behind its neighbor in the front. So I'll add that darker color right along the bottom, rinse the paintbrush off, wipe off the extra water, and then feather and fade that darker color up into the leaf. And the feathering and fading effect will work better or worse depending on the paper that you have. Some papers, like the paper I'm on here, which is 100% cotton paper, are very, very forgiving. So I have a longer dry time and it doesn't tend to streak as much. Some papers, there's even some cotton papers and some sketchbooks, like the Hana Mule sketchbooks, that tend to be very streaky. So that's one reason why I like this paper a lot. Before I forget, and since I know I'm going to want to add a tiny bit of very light blue to this flower, I want to use as close to my cleanish, perfect, bright yellow as I can and put in little stamens inside of this flower. So there's those little friends. But I can also use that bright yellow at a tiny bit lower saturation to add in these really fun little yellow petals that stuck out from my beautiful paintbrushes. There we go. So we're moving right along. Since this is all still a little bit damp in through here, I now get to jump north again. I'm going to go back to my paintbrush flowers, and we get to add our second layer of color, which I'm super excited about, because for this one, I think I'm going to use, I'm cleaning off my red. We can actually tell it's a red now. I think I'm just going to use straight red. This one's a Perylene red. That's Perylene. It's one of my absolute favorite, really vibrant. Again, it's a very primary red, like fire engine red. And I just love it for that reason. It mixes really well with other things. It plays pretty nice. And I'm using the same little angled, like fanned out brush strokes, mirroring the other shapes that I had already made, covering up some of the white if I want to, or leaving it, but really just trying to basically shade in behind my petal shapes. So like this petal right there, I'm leaving with more of the white in there because I want it to feel like it's in front of the other ones. So I'm using this darker color like a shadow and to add more extra interest in there. In a couple of spots on my little yellow offshoots, I'm going to wipe the extra paint off and then just add the teeniest little bit of red into some of those just because they were feeling a little bit pasted on. So a little bit of red just next to most of those little offshoots. So they have a wee bit more vivacity and visual interest than they did before. Switching gears up to my other flower, and I'll put these lines in a little bit slower. So if you missed the last ones, you could watch them on this one. My lines are just roughly matching the way that each individual fire-shaped petal angles away from me. So this one, they're all going up and slightly to the right. This petal back here is behind that one, so I want it to be more red. Those will angle up and to the right. Then when I switch to this left side, these brush strokes now will go up and to the left. So I am always really thinking about how can I best use my brush strokes to mimic the flow of whatever I'm painting, whether it's the lines of a glacier or water or parts of a flower, like right here. I'm always thinking about trying to get my brush strokes to really mirror the topography of my subject. Because that just ends up having the most organic and interesting shapes, at least in my mind, and it makes it easier to paint them, I think. By just thinking about how to actually mirror those same shapes. And I'll also lean back and try to look at something and say, is something catching my eye and looking weird? Like right here, this big white V definitely is. So I'm going to eliminate a fair bit of the white inside the center of that flower and cover up even more right up here as well. So that way now I put more pink in and it just feels like it's a little bit less. There was a dead spot in the painting basically where this really unusual white V shape was capturing my eye. And when my eye gets stuck somewhere, I always try to change it that way so I don't end up just getting lost in that one space. Okay, we're actually really close to being done with our flower, which is very fun, and I can't believe it already. Painting flowers is one of the things that I find just to be the most absorbing. It always goes by really fast. Our leaves for our lupin are going to be very, very simple, and we'll do them in one pass. Just some areas lighter, some areas darker. I'm going to take my lupin color and then combine it with some of this color for the Queen's Cup flowers. I get this grayish bluish color, add a bit more of my cobalt blue to that, and then I have my leaf color. It's a bluish greenish color. Nothing too fancy. And I'll put it on the page. If that feels a little bit too bluish, then I can add a little bit more of my yellow in there and a little bit more blue to compensate if I get too far off to the side. And really, it should be a bluish greenish color. Am I exaggerating the bluish nature of this color? Absolutely, right? Like these petals are probably, not petals, these leaves are very not that far off, possibly from our other flower in real life. But oftentimes in paintings, I'm just not afraid to like change colors a little bit and exaggerate, or like unexaggerate and decentralize focus from something by making the colors lighter. Like right back here, I want these leaves to be behind, and that one kind of wraps in front, but they're just a little bit lighter, so that way they don't command quite as much attention. So I'm intentionally saturating and desaturating colors to change the focus and move the focus around the painting, and just to make sure that I don't just have the same exact green across an entire painting, because that gets kind of boring. I really want some blue. This shape is looking very boring, very blobby. So I'm going to put some clean water drops into that shape to encourage some blooms to happen, so it can hopefully get a little bit less blobby. These leaves here got a little tiny bit too rounded on the tips, I think. So I can always then just take my paint and just deviate from my lovely pen and pencil lines if I want, and I can come back later and re-add in some more pen lines if I need to. So if something isn't looking right, then I'm never afraid with it, if I can, to just go in there and change up something so that way it does look correct on the page. I think all those want to be a little bit bigger, so I'll make them all a little bit bigger and more pointy. That feels better. Yay. For the stem of our lovely lupin, it's just, I'm going to use pretty much the same color as our Queen's Cup. So cobalt blue, Hansa yellow medium, whatever mix I have, and just put in a fine line of dark bluish yellow color right along that stem. I want to be a little bit more yellow than that, so I'll just switch to a tiny bit more yellow on there. And if I wanted to, I could switch to adding a different color yellow to this, but for right here, I'm not going to bother. Just keep it simple for now. There's our lupin stem. Stems are so nice because it really doesn't take much. Just a little bit of green here, a little bit of green there. And then, oh, that was a little bit too big of a stem, but that's all right. I can lift off some of that color. There we go. And then, oh my gosh, we're so close. Okay, so we have just a couple things left. One of which is to add in our leaves for our paintbrush flowers. For this, I'm going to use my darker yellow because I do want these leaves to feel like they're a different plant altogether. So that darker yellow combined with the same blue is going to give me a slightly muddier, almost dingier green, which is a more accurate color for our beautiful paintbrush flowers. I might even push that farther by mixing in some of the red and pink into that, and then I really will have a more brownish greenish color. Again, am I accentuating the difference there more than what I see in reality? Yes. But that's in service of trying to make sure that my flowers all feel like they're different from each other. So there's the little branches and stems there. And just like the other ones, does not take much. We can just put some lines, fill it in. That's one of the nice things about having the pen lines down, I find, is that it does just give me, I don't have to paint as much on the page, basically. So there's those leaves. I can rinse the paintbrush, add a tiny bit of clean water along some of those edges, just for fun to see what kind of blooms I will get on there. I'm not sure yet, but we'll find out. The last and final detail, there'll be two things I'll add to my painting. First of which will be take a little bit of my blue, turn it into a slight green, then come back into these petals, not petals, I can call them petals, they look like petals. Come back into my lovely lupin leaves and just add a little bit of secondary shading and just some more texture to those leaves. They were just a little bit boring. Just a couple little angled lines here and there will just help to bring a little bit of visual interest back to those leaves, because in this painting here, without that second Queen's Cup flower, this area right here is carrying a much bigger visual weight to it. So I wanted to bring a little bit more to compensate for that lack of that focal point. I wanted to have a bit more detail in those leaves, so I can compensate for that with those little few extra lines. And then the final detail will be taking some of that cobalt blue. I want just pure cobalt blue, and I want it to be very, very, very light, like barely even blue. And I'll come into my gorgeous little Queen's Cup and just add the most subtle, gentle little shading right along the bottom edge of those rollover petals. So right in there. A little bit of shading right along and next to some of the stamens, maybe along one of the upper edges of the petal, and a little bit right there. And I hope you can see that. It might be so subtle that it's not visible, in which case I can darken it just a little bit so it shows up better on the camera. But I'm really just being very, very gentle with this blue. I don't want too much of it. Like I'm bordering too much, but I want it to show up for you. So I'm exaggerating the blue just a tiny bit. But hopefully you can see that just a little tiny hint of shadow all of a sudden brought that flower to life and took it from a flat, dead shape into a shape that actually feels like it has more three-dimensionality to it. And the key there was just bringing that light blue right beneath the two folded over petals. Because without that shadow, our brains could maybe figure out it was a fold over, but our brains are super good at taking minimal information and then filling in and putting it in context. So our brain knows that shadow beneath highlight means that something is behind and something is in front, so therefore a rolled over petal. And then, oh my gosh, we forgot this stem. So I'm going to grab some blue and then just mix it into this darker color up here. Doesn't really matter exactly which green it is, just has to be darker than what I had behind. I might even leave a little bit of white just along the edge of the stem just for fun, just so that way it stands out from the stuff behind it. There's also these cute little leaflets that come right up along the bottom of the flower. And okay, that might be a little bit too dark. We'll have to see. It's really showing up on the camera. Maybe I'll cut away a little bit of that white border there. And that's looking pretty good. It's just got a little bit bigger than I would have liked there, but that happens sometimes. I guess I can always lift it out and then put the color back in more where I want it. There we are. There's our last flower. Okay. That might have been a little bit of a whirlwind. If so, thank you for taking the time to paint that with me. And I hope that was fun. I love painting flowers. And one of my big goals this summer is to film a scene somewhat like this, actually in the field next to the wildflowers for my Adventure Art Academy students. And if you don't know what that is, the Adventure Art Academy is my ongoing monthly series of watercolor classes that I film outside and on site on various locations all over the West, even up into Yukon and Alaska, and into Utah as well. And some of the paintings that we did recently in that course, we had this one right here, was a glacier painting. This month's was one of our more complex lessons. It was this beautiful desert scene, which was just so fun. Definitely a more complex one. So I try to have a range of complexity and difficulty. This was from last May, that ice field scene. And this will likely be one for this summer. This was filmed last year up at a glacier called Columbia Glacier in the North Cascades. And it will also have some fun little flowers there. And then I also have a similar scene to this one right here that I filmed last fall as well, with the tree canopy up above us. So yeah. And if you're interested in that, I'll be sending everybody a follow-up email tomorrow with the recording. And then in that recording, I'll include links to all of that jazz. And I forgot to mention that as an Adventure Art Academy student, you also get access to a really, like, if you found the sketching portion of this to be more complex and difficult, then I'm biased, but I highly recommend checking out. I did a 5-week ink sketching class, and students, I walked them through every week different scenes from trees to mountains, and we really focused on how to break down a very complex scene into more manageable pieces. That was one that I made when I was practicing. That class has the option that if you want, I provided reference images every day for students so they could continue to practice every day in between our lessons. So, all right. So that's my little spiel. You guys will get more information there. And then I'm actually doing a foundations watercolor class as well, starting in the first week in April. It'll be a 3-week course where we'll meet once a week, and I'll be talking a lot more about the like blending and some of the ways that watercolor does what it does. And the sketching class was part of the Adventure Art Academy classes. Yeah. So if you sign up there, that sketching class is there. It's already integrated fully with the recording. And I had so much fun with it, honestly. And I'm also like, it was such a success and so many folks tuned in that I'm excited to offer it again. I think I'm gonna do it once a year for a while. And yes, please do share your paintings on Discord. So I started earlier in the year a Discord channel for the Adventure Art Academy community. So those students and alumni from that group as well, we have our own little private online space. I just get so excited about the other classes in that community and the amazing students that are there and just folks all over the world. It makes me so happy. So hopefully I'm not droning on too much about it. This was another part of the ink sketching class, was doing very simple contour line drawings. It was really fun because I had some folks who were just like all in on simple contours and some that were all about the more mountainy detailed stuff, which was super fun. But it was really neat to see everybody just developing their own styles as we went along. Oh, and look at this ink. Isn't this fun? But it's just like very metallic-y, gorgeous stuff. And I find it so fun. Any questions before I wrap us up for the evening? So thank you all again. And I hope to see you in a class or something like this again soon.